Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, March 19th, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the inconsistency when it comes down to our 2022 generic ballot polling data. Now, this is a number that I've been referencing far too often, or not necessarily far too often, but probably a very large amount, and it is a number that is very reflective of where the national environment stands, and this is our generic ballot polling number, pretty much where the average American, or more so where the national average lies between Democrats and Republicans as a means of gauging the interest and the support for either political party ahead of our November midterms. And the reason why this number is so important is because it can help us understand what type of year a year is going to end up becoming. And what I mean by that essentially is whether or not a year is going to be a red wave, a blue wave, or just a mediocre year for either political party. Looking at the 2018 generic ballot polling data, you will find that the Democratic Party being ahead for a very long period of time was an indicator, and did end up becoming true, an indicator that Democrats were going to win back control of the House of Representatives, that they were also going to be competitive in a number of close Senate races as they were in West Virginia, Montana, Missouri, Texas even, and a bunch of other states. And we knew this because the generic ballot was telling us that the Democratic Party was up about 9 points nationwide. The same thing for Republicans back in 2010 when they saw their numbers putting them ahead by 9.4% on the eve of the election. This 9.4% lead told us that Republicans were undoubtedly going to win back control of the House of Representatives in addition to pick up numerous seats in the United States Senate. But now for 2022, we are in a position where we don't have a clear/substantial lead for either political party. The Republican Party has maintained a lead for a very brief period of time. They've been ahead for about, 4 to 5 months now, and not necessarily a very brief period of time. I meant to say a very minuscule amount. They're ahead by 2.3%, which is nothing really super substantial. A 2.3% lead is well within the margin of error of 3.5%, meaning that it truly could go to the Democratic Party if there was an alternative type of wave election. And that's something that we do need to understand as well, that the Republican Party being up 2.3% doesn't mean that they are going to win by 2.3%. Considering the margin of error, the Democratic Party could actually win the national popular vote at this point in time. But it isn't likely, and I say that in full confidence. I think the Republican Party is still on track to win control of the House and the United States Senate, but we do have to understand that the polling numbers are telling us something that is a little bit different from what we heard in 2010 or 2018. And that these numbers are pretty much different from each other. I mean, what we're finding from YouGov and Yahoo News is that the Democrats are up by 4 points, but then here you have Rasmussen report saying Republicans are up 11 points. You have another poll from Monmouth University showing Democrats up by 1, then Insider Advantage showing the Republicans up by 8. The Republican Party still obviously has an advantage, being ahead by 2.3% on average, but it seems to be going back and forth. I saw people describe this as two different worlds of polling, and I think that is the best way to describe it. You have these organizations, which are in many ways reputable, such as Monmouth University, YouGov, Morning Consult, that are showing us very different numbers from what we are seeing from other polling companies who may not necessarily be as well known, but still are pretty much indicating where our national environment is based off of the average and based off of what we know about Joe Biden's approval rating, based off of what we know about midterms in historical context. Everything tells us that 2022 should be a red wave year. Yet we aren't seeing number after number showing us that, but rather every other one, which is just very interesting and puts us in a very difficult type of position. But I would also like to point out that we saw a very similar thing happen back in 2002 and 2014. What happened in those years? Well, 2002 was a midterm that defied expectations. Despite President George W. Bush being in office, the Republican Party gained seats in those midterm elections. A lot of people attribute it to the impact of the coalescing around George W. Bush and the Republican Party after 9/11, which I think is very much true. You do have to understand that in a time of crisis, the American public does tend to circle around the American president. So that happened, but the polling data did go back and forth like it did in 2014, which I will show you in just a moment. You see, on election day, the Republicans were only up 1.7%, but they ended up winning by 4.6%. And the Democratic Party led in some polls, led in the Washington Post ABC News poll, but were down in the CNN Gallup poll that had Republicans up by 6%. It went back and forth, and ultimately, the GOP ended up winning. Again, same thing happened in 2014. The Democrats and Republicans seem to have been back and forth when it came down to the polling data. While 2014, in many people's eyes, should have been a red wave, considering the Senate map and considering our national environment where Obama's approval rating was, the generic ballot didn't necessarily reflect that. Republicans were up by 3 in one poll, then down by 1 in the other, up by 8 in the other, down by 1 in the other, up by 6, down by 1, up by 8, down by 1, with the average showing the Republicans ahead by a very similar amount to where they are right now, 2.4% versus 2.3%. But the Republicans ended up winning by 3.3% more, 5.7%, expanded their House majority, and won back control of the United States Senate. If you want to take a look at that Senate election, we can actually go ahead and take a look here. 2014, the Republican Party picked up 9 seats. You have Alaska, Colorado, Montana, South Dakota, Louisiana, North Carolina. Let's see if I'm forgetting any. West Virginia. There should be 2 more, Arkansas, and then Iowa. These were the pickups for the GOP. You had 9 seats that the Republican Party had. Remember, this was 2012, right? 55 to 45. What happened in 2014? 54 to 46. So a 9-seat gain, monumental. Truly monumental victory for the GOP, and the House elections were even worse for the Democratic Party. 2014 gave the Republican Party 247 seats to the Democratic Party's 188. Now, the different thing about our 2022 midterms is that while the national environment could very well end up in the same way it did in 2014 and 2002, where the polling data shows back and forth data between Democrats and Republicans, with Republicans ultimately having the upper hand, which again, I do not doubt, and I never mean to cast a doubt on that. I do think they will win both chambers, but the playing field has changed. We are no longer under the 2014 House map. You see, the 2014 House map was 2 cycles, the second cycle, after the Republican Party had the opportunity. And I say the Republican Party because they controlled the majority of states and districts at that time that congressional redistricting was underway, as they did in 2020. The Republican Party gerrymandered. And I don't mean just by a little bit. States such as Ohio became exceptionally Republican. Look at how some of these districts are drawn. States such as North Carolina became exceptionally Republican. How, you might ask? Because Republicans gerrymandered the crap out of these states. And it worked effectively. Enough so that the Democratic Party could not win back control of the House until 2018, 8 years later after the maps were drawn. In 2014 was an excellent display of the Republican Party's ability to defeat Democrats through, yes, an advantage nationwide of 5 points, but also an advantage when it came down to congressional redistricting. The good news for Democrats, we are no longer under this map. The map has actually gotten a lot bluer since 2014. Not because there are new districts, but the 2020 House elections were more of an indicator of what a mediocre year might look like. Democrats only won this popular vote by 3 points compared to the popular vote on the presidential election of 5. And looking at this 3-point advantage, that's generally where we should see the Democratic Party in a more neutral year. So keeping that in mind, 51 to 48 and the Democrats winning 222, the House map has certainly gotten a lot better. The Democrats have more opportunities now because they have eroded suburban support for the GOP in many, many states, enough so that they're able to solidify states such as New Jersey that maybe 6 years prior to this election had equal Democrats and Republicans and now has 10 Democrats and 2 Republicans, keeping that in mind altogether. So now that we are in a position where our new House map is more favored for the Democrats than the old one, you have to understand that even if Republicans do match the 2002 and 2014 type of environment where it's back and forth, but Republicans ultimately end up having the upper hand, it's going to be more difficult for them to replicate 2014, in fact, near impossible, just because this map has been turned and put in a way that it makes it so impossible for the GOP to win. For instance, if we take a look at the state of Illinois in 2014, a very good example. The Republican Party had 8 seats in 2014. The Democrats had 10. And this made sense for our national environment. When you take a look at the generic ballot in the state of Illinois, you will find that Republicans nearly defeated the Democratic Party. So 10 to 8 wasn't bad in terms of overall representation. But guess what the new map has given the Republican Party? Not 8 seats, not even 6, what they used to have, but instead 3. You heard me correctly. They gave the Republican Party 3 seats, which means in a red wave, at most, they would be getting 4 seats instead of the previous 8. And this can be found in many other states. Let's go back to our House elections here and show you another example of what gerrymandering can do effectively for the Democratic Party and make it so 2022, despite again replicating 2014 or 2002, turning it into a better year for the Democratic Party. New York in 2014, 9 Republicans, 18 Democrats. Let's take a look at what New York looks like today. The state of New York now gives the Republican Party in a neutral year 4 seats. Guess how many they have? 26 in total. They give the Republican Party 4. You see a lot of light blue here, and you're thinking, okay, couldn't the Democrats lose some of these seats in a wave? Technically speaking, yes. But here's the thing. Republicans currently hold some of them. And all of these lean blue seats are Biden double digit or more, which means Republicans would have to do a Virginia and a half in order to win these seats. Not just the standard erosion like we saw in New Jersey and Virginia, but more than that. You can't necessarily count on them doing that if Republicans can't field top-tier candidates and every single eye is on a bunch of other races compared to just those 2 individual ones like they were in 2021, which makes it a lot more difficult. In most cases, Republicans are probably only going to win 6 or maybe 7 seats out of the state of New York, not the 9 that they had before. And that means also the Democratic Party will increase representation and thus push the Republicans further down the line. So just keep in mind that our House map is no longer as favored to the GOP as it once was. Even though the Republican Party absolutely could have, for some reason, they didn't. It just didn't happen. Not for some reason. The courts failed them. Their own state legislatures failed them. Their governors failed them. Whatever, right? That's all discussion for plenty of other videos that I've already done. Moving on to our other elections that are occurring, you also have coinciding Senate elections with these House elections. The thing about 2014 and also 2002 is that they were working under the same Senate tier, meaning that they were working within the same Senate elections. Well, that's not the case this time around. The Senate map from 2014, you can see, obviously, looked a lot worse for the Democratic Party. They were defending seats in South Dakota, solid red now. Montana, solid red now. Arkansas, solid red now. West Virginia, solid red now, right? Those are 4 seats off the bat. They were defending seats in Alaska, which makes sense why it flipped to the GOP. They were defending seats in Iowa, a likely red state now. Joni Ernst recently won re-election back in 2020. North Carolina, a red state. I mean, it's really only a shock to see Louisiana, also a red state, right? The only real shock here is the state of Colorado, which only went to the GOP by 1.9%. And considering its previous swing state status, it made sense. But now we are working under a different Senate map, which means the Republican Party has less opportunities for pickups. In no circumstance would they ever get 9 pickups in 2022. And by comparison to 2014, won't be an on-caliber year or on-par year as that wave. And looking at our Senate map here, the Democratic Party also has opportunities too. 2014, they really didn't have many, if any at all. They were playing defense the entire time. And while Democrats are going to be playing defense in 4 major states, New Hampshire, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, these 4 incumbents all lucked out because they're running for re-election, and the Republicans don't necessarily have top-tier candidates like Democrats do in many of these races. And Democrats are also playing offense in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Ohio. And it is just interesting to see that Democrats are contesting states that aren't necessarily, meant to be contested when you are expecting an opposition wave year. But because the numbers don't tell us directly who's winning, Democrats are still going for every single race that they can get. And it hasn't become clear that it is going to be a red wave because the numbers are inconsistent. So again, to reiterate for the 3rd time, I still expect the GOP to win. I think they will win in these November elections, but I do think that the contested data here does tell us something. It does tell us that there's still a bit amount of resistance against the GOP nationwide, and I think that has become very evident when it comes down to many of these competitive Senate elections that in a traditional red or blue wave year should be lopsided much more in favor of the opposing political party to whoever is in the White House, right? If this was 2018, many of these states we would have known how they were going to go ahead of time. Way ahead of time. Pennsylvania would be likely blue at this point. Wisconsin likely would join that characterization, right? North Carolina would not be this shade of red. Georgia would not be this shade of red. Not necessarily going back to 2018, but a 2018 type of environment today. But we aren't really seeing that for the GOP when it comes down to their 2010 or, another type of wave environment. And it is something to be said about the differing numbers here. 2 different worlds of polling. Democrats up in one, Republicans up in the other. Reminiscent of 2002 and 2014 when it comes down to what we saw then, which Republicans ultimately ended up having the upper hand, which I expect, But because we are on a different playing field, we are in a different House map on a different Senate map than both of 2002 and 2014, it is something to be pointed out as well that Republicans might not experience the level of victories or level of pickups or opportunities that they had in the past, simply because the entire playing field is completely different from what they had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and likely will be different 10 years down the line as well. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.